All right, hello again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I've been going over the PowerPoint presentations for Murachs, HTML5, and CSS3 3rd edition for the AWD Application and Web Development 1000 Web Technologies class, and I'm on Chapter 8 of 19. And Chapter 8, as you can see, is on responsive web design, and we have 4 applied objectives and 8 knowledge objectives. Given an HTML document for the desktop that uses fixed layout, convert it so that it uses fluid width scalable images and fonts that are inherited by child elements. Given an HTML document for the desktop that uses fluid layout, add media queries that change the appearance of the page depending on the size of the screen where it's displayed. Given an HTML document with a navigation menu that uses media queries, use the SlickNav plugin to replace the navigation menu on smaller screen sizes. Use the browser developer tools to test your responsive designs. Those are the 4 applied objectives. For knowledge, describe the 3 components of a responsive web design. Describe 3 basic ways you can test a responsive design. Explain how fluid layouts compare to fixed layouts. Explain why you should use relative font sizes with a responsive design. Describe the use of the meta element for setting the viewport on mobile devices. Describe the basic syntax of a media query. Describe 2 standard approaches for developing media queries for responsive design. And explain why you might want to use a SlickNav menu when developing a responsive design. So, a responsive design, for lack of better words, is one that looks good on all devices, whether that device is a desktop, a laptop, a tablet, a phone, or even something else. All right? So there it is on a desktop, there it is on mobile, okay? As mentioned on pages 282 and 283, there are 3 components of responsive design. The first is that you use a fluid layout, and the big thing about a fluid layout is it's not fixed. In other words, it will adjust the width of the web page, so the stuff that's on the screen will look good as the web page gets bigger or smaller, or gets looked at on different kinds of devices. Second, it uses media queries to adjust the appearance of a web page to different device sizes. Finally, it uses scalable images. So the size of an image is scaled to the size of the element that contains it. So although you can use a fluid layout to adjust the width of the structural elements on a page, you can't use them to adjust the appearance of the page, and that's where these media queries come in. Okay, so we are going to look at that. So remember, and they mention this on the bottom of page 283 in the text, websites that are developed using responsive web design are designed to adapt gracefully to the size of the screen on which the page is being displayed. So how do you test for that? Well, if you look up on the screen here, you know, they've got an example. In an ideal world, you would, once you do this, you would test on every browser there is and every version of every browser there is. Sorry about that. All right, so again, in an ideal world, you would test your website on every browser that there is and on every size of every browser there is. But that's not how life works. Because there's so many different devices, so many screen sizes, so many browsers, so many versions, etc., that wouldn't be very practical. Now, the author suggests that you may want to use a web-based tool like ProtoFluid, which I've never used. But as it says, it lets you view a web page in the screen sizes used by many different browsers. All right. A simple way to test a responsive design is to use the developer tools. That's what they're showing right here. Remember, you bring up the developer tools in most browsers like Chrome and IE and Firefox by hitting the F12 key. All right. So you display it, and I don't know, there's typically you can go in there and, for example, in Chrome, you can click the toggle device mode icon that's on the left-hand side of the developer toolbar, and that's where the author is showing you. It's right down here. All right, then you can select the device you want to emulate from the drop-down list at the top of the page. Well, let's look at that once. So I will bring up a web page. That's not going to work well, but try that. And hit F12. And right here, there you go, toggle device toolbar. Control-Shift-M. Well, and it is changing the size as I'm going through here. Oh, brother. So this is what the author says as far as the 3 best ways to test a responsive design. The one I already mentioned was use a tool like ProtoFluid. The second one I also mentioned, use device emulators. And third, use the developer tools. All right. So let's look at the difference between fixed and fluid width. This is actually a really good slide because when you look at it, you can notice that when you're working with fixed width, you're using absolute units of measurement, in this case, pixels. When you're working with fluid width, you're using a relative unit of measure, in this case, percentages. So a fixed layout uses absolute measurements to specify the width of the page and the structural elements on the page. A fluid layout uses percentages. All right. This will help you to be able to do responsive design because this will make it easier to adapt gracefully to any and all screen sizes. So how do you convert from fixed width to fluid width? Well, first, I guess the author shows you some benefits of using fluid. Again, it all goes down with the fact that they're scalable when you use fluid. All right. So if you've already developed a web page that uses fixed width, you'll need to know how to convert the widths in pixels to widths in percentages. To do that, you can use the formula that's shown at the top here. Target divided by context times 100 equals result. Now remember, you're doing a divide and you're doing a multiply. They're at the same level. So you do the target divided by the context, take the result, and multiply it by 100. The width of the outermost element determines how much of the screen the page will occupy. Typically, the width will be set between 90% and 100%. In addition to converting the widths of the structural elements on a page to percents, you should convert the left and right-hand margins and padding to percents. Okay, but you cannot specify the width of a border using a percent. If you want to limit the width of an element, you can use the max width property. So there's a little bit of work that has to be done in order to be able to do this. Back in Chapter 4, we recommend, the author recommended here that you use relative measures for your font sizes. When you do that, users can vary the sizes in their browser. This is really important for responsive design too. That way the size of the font used is relative to the size of the font used by the percent element, or by the parent element. All right. In this book, the author specifies relative font sizes as percent, but you can also use what are called EMS, EMS, and that's basically, it has to literally do with the letter M and how much space it takes, okay? When you specify the size of a font for a fluid layout, you should use EMS or percents. When you do that, the size you specify all right, as mentioned, when my heat goes on, I have to pause this. So, we talked about sizing fonts. For most browsers, the default font size is 16 pixels, 16px. All right. Now, you also have to worry about, when you're scaling all this stuff, you also have to worry about scaling images. If you want to know, I guess I shouldn't skip that. All right. 1M equals about 16 pixels. Okay. So here's a scalable image in a fluid layout. What you want is the image to scale with the element that it's in. Typically, the way that you do that is you set the max width property for the image to 100%. And they're going to show that, I believe, on the next slide. That way, what the image does is it's always wide enough as the section that contains it. All right. Now, some developers, and they mention this in the book, also like to set the height property to a value, like, for example, auto, when they scale images. And if you do that, the aspect ratio of the height to the width will remain the same regardless. But auto is the default, so some people do it and some don't. It really and truly, at least it should not matter whether you do it or you don't do it. All right, so the next thing that's shown here is they're going to show you a web page that uses fluid design. So it'll use a lot of the stuff that we've already talked about. All right, and it's something that they've been working with before. It'll use scalable images. The font size has been converted to EMS. All right. And there you go. And the author says on the bottom of page 294, you'll need to use media queries if you want to change the appearance of the page for different screen widths. Again, as we talked about, you kind of have a choice. And there's even more choices than what are shown in the book. Some people go mobile first, and they build the site first for a small device like a phone, because it's much easier to scale up than it is to scale down. All right. Other people build a whole different site when they're doing this. And one thing we haven't even gotten into, because this book doesn't touch on it at all, but we will discuss it in class, is using a product called Bootstrap, which helps you create responsive web pages. So they say we're going to have to use media queries. So let's talk about what a media query is. And this starts on page 296 in the book. And just checking how much I've got left in here. So when you develop a website that uses responsive design, you'll want to make sure that you configure what's called the viewport, and that you configure it appropriately for mobile devices. Now, that's going to be shown in here. So you say meta name equal viewport. All right. So the viewport on a mobile browser works differently than the viewport on a desktop, that works differently than a viewport on a laptop, etc. Of course, on a desktop, the viewport is the visible area of the web page. So that's going to be, the user can change that by changing the size of their browser window. On the other hand, the viewport on a mobile device, all right, might be larger, it might be smaller than the visible area. So when you use these media queries, you want to make sure that the web page isn't reduced, since the media queries will adjust the appearance of the page based on the screen size. And what that means is you want the page to look like, okay, more like this than like this. Now, the other stuff that's in here, let's just talk about all of it. The width is the logical width of the viewport that will be specified in pixels. You can also use the device width, as they show right here. That's a keyword, and that indicates that the viewport should use the width of the screen in CSS pixels, basically at 100% of scale. All right. The height, which is not shown here, is the logical height of the viewport in pixels. Initial scale is a number that indicates the initial zoom factor that's used to display the page. Minimum scale is a number that indicates the minimum zoom. Maximum scale is a number that indicates the maximum zoom. And user scalable indicates whether or not you can zoom. So when you look at this, this says viewport, which implies mobile. It says, if possible, use 100% of the width and scale it at 100% to begin with. All right, and I should say that, let me change that. This says viewport, which means mobile. This says device width. So this says basically base your width off of whatever device you're using, but try to scale it up for 100%. All right, that's my take on it, at least. So the viewport on a mobile device determines the content that's displayed on the screen. You can use a meta element to control the viewport for a device. When you use media queries, you should set the width to device width, and you should always set the initial scale to 1. As far as coding media queries, all right, what you're basically doing is you're trying to come up and say, oh my gosh. All right, as we plot along through here, again, we are starting to get into media queries and the like. So a media query, when you use one, you create what's called a media selector, and that's what this is right here. It specifies the media type for the query, and basically what you're doing is you're saying, a lot of times when you do this, you're saying, hey, when my screen size is in a certain dimension, I want it to look like this, for lack of better words. These are literally known as conditional expressions, this one and this one. Each conditional expression can check, I don't know, at least one of the properties that we talked about before, the mins and the maxes, etc. The screen size at which a media query changes the appearance of the screen is known as a breakpoint. Media queries are supported by the current versions of basically every browser. They're also supported by all the current versions of any mobile browser. All right. So let's look at some common, what they call at least, common media queries for responsive design. Here's all the browsers that basically support media queries. So here's some. So notice when you say 960 and above, tablet, landscape, and desktop layout. All right, 768 to 959, tablet portrait. 480 to 767, mobile in a landscape format. 479 and below, mobile portrait layout. All right. So remember, a kind of a standard technique here is to start with queries for larger devices and then work your way down. That's what we're looking at here. All right. Other times you go the other way. You start with the lowest and you work your way up. When you use these techniques, each media query inherits the styles that preceded it on the style sheet, including any styles that are coded outside of the media query. What you'll see when we get into this is media queries are typically put in a CSS file at the very bottom of the file. They do mention in the book, it says here, this figure shows some common media queries used to implement a responsive design. There are two standard techniques for developing queries you need. First, you can start with a desktop design, which is what they did here, and then develop successively for the next smallest size. That's what they've done here. Otherwise, again, you can start with the smallest and work your way up. When you start with the smallest and you work your way up, that's known as mobile first design. All right. Now next, the author kind of changes, for lack of better words, changes focus here and talks about how to build responsive menus using a built-in jQuery plugin called SlickNav. To use this, you've got to go out to http://slicknav.com. That's where you download the zip file from. You unzip the file, and you have to add the slicknav.css and the jQuery.slicknav.min.js files to the website. Now, before you use this, you have to include a link, and you've got a link to that slicknav.css file and a script element for the jQuery.slicknav.min.js file. You also have to make sure you include jQuery, and you have to include that above where you include the jQuery.slicknav.min.js file. Okay? What this is going to basically do is it makes it easier for you to set up navigation systems on smaller devices. So there's the HTML that would use, and there would be the CSS. Now, hopefully, with what I'm about to tell you right now, hopefully this makes some sense. There is so doggone much in this book. There isn't a way to go over everything. So if I'm missing things, it's not that I'm trying to do it. I'm trying to hit what I consider to be the most important aspects in the book. You may or may not agree with that, and that's your right. Okay? So, the last three parts of this chapter present a web page that uses a responsive design. It's the same one that we've been looking at. Okay? This is the one that earlier in the chapter we were developing using a fluid layout, but now it's also going to be using media queries. So they say if figure 12, this figure there, shows this on a mobile device, and you can see it on a mobile device in both landscape and portrait modes. Now, just so you're aware of this, and I think you are, there's probably not a magical way that you could make every website look fantastic on any kind of device. All right? If you compare, in this case, if you compare the way it looks here on the desktop with the way that it looks on a phone, you'll notice some major differences. Everything's smaller, of course, but margins and borders have been removed when you have it on the phone. You want as much area, be able to use as much area as you can. The logo is displayed above the text, and the header and the logo are centered. All right. And that SlickNav menu was used here rather than the standard format. So it's got this menu thing right here. When you click it, some books call that a hamburger menu. And when you click it, it'll actually show the different menu options. So it'll look more like this. When you click here, it'll look more like this. So the web page uses a fluid layout and scalable images like it did back in Figure 8.7, but it also uses media queries to change the appearance of the page depending on the size of the screen in which it's displayed. All right. The HTML is shown here. If you compare this from what was, what we've looked at even in earlier chapters, there's two main differences. First, the widths of the images in the header and the article have been omitted. That way they can be scaled using CSS. All right. And that's typically what you should be doing. Because if you actually do scaling in the HTML, you're mixing, all right, CSS in your HTML, not considered to be a good thing to do. Second, the sequence of the aside and the articles have been switched. That way the article will be displayed before the aside of the page. All right. And next we have the CSS. What the author did is 309 and 311 contain all of the CSS, and 313, all right, for this. And the author put comments in for everything that's been changed. See that? All right. I'm not going to be going over any of this, but it's the kind of thing you definitely should go out and take a look at. All right. So this is all exercise stuff at the end of the chapter. So again, we've reached the end of another chapter. We've now reached the end of section 1 of the book. So I'm going to come back soon and do section 2, which is chapters 9 through 14. Section 3 is chapters 15 through 17, which is kind of a beginning primer, so to speak, on JavaScript and jQuery. And 17 is on how to design a website, and 18 is on how to deploy a website. All right, I'll have a lot more to say about a lot of these things as we go on in here. So I'll be back shortly.